I sense the summer vibes in our midst here. I don't know about you, but this week we're leaving off for a vacation. My family and I, we're going to be gone for a few weeks, but you're going to have some great teachers and preachers here on Sunday as you continue to come to church. I'm sure some of you are going to travel as well. Some of you are going to go to familiar places with your families. Some of you are going to be in places that you've never been before, visiting and doing tourist stuff and enjoying the local food and the local attractions. And, I would imagine that some of you are going to stay in Airbnbs, as you travel. How many of you guys have Airbnbs booked this summer? Yeah? Now, wouldn't it be weird if you go into an Airbnb, and this has happened to me before. I've gone into an Airbnb, and you get in there, and you're like, this doesn't look at all like the pictures. Right? And, you start going to the different rooms of the house that you're staying, and, the kitchen is not exactly like you saw in the pictures. You're like, man, these people are really good at Photoshop. You begin to think to yourself. You go to the bedrooms, you don't like the decorations. There's a weird smell. And if you're staying there for a short amount of time, you just push through, right? You're just like, I guess I just have to express myself in the reviews later on. Or you call your host and you ask him to make some adjustments. But wouldn't it be weird if you said, hey, I don't like the decorations. If you said to your spouse, I don't like it, let's go to a furniture store and let's buy some furniture and let's bring it to this Airbnb. Let's put some paintings on the wall. And I just don't like the color of the dishes and the plates. Let's buy new dishes. And let's replace the rugs here. Like, if you did that, it would be nuts, right? Because you're like, why are you going to spend money in a place that is temporary, and you're not going to stay there forever? At least you're not going to stay there for a long time. And yet, as ridiculous as that sounds, that's oftentimes how we live our lives. Life in this world is temporary. And yet we spend a lot of our resources trying to make everything a little bit more comfortable, when in reality, the Bible teaches that we are really not made for this world. And so much of our efforts are in vain. See, the Bible has this overarching theme, which is the theme of this new sermon series that we are launching today. The Bible speaks to the truth that every single one of us here in this room experiences spiritual homelessness, and that we're all journeying towards home. The Bible talks about the wrong ways by which we try to find home, but then it offers us hope for a home as well. That's what we'll be looking at for the summer weeks. And we're going to start off right from the beginning of the Bible with this theme of homelessness and homecoming. In the book of Genesis, chapter 3, the book of Genesis is the book that explains the origin of things, of how everything came about. But it also explains how everything went wrong, how everything went south and bad. That God created a perfect world, but humanity, who was also created by God, found a way to screw up what God did. And therefore, in this story of origin, we have the explanation by which we can understand why life is the way that it is. So I'm going to read from chapter 3. This is the chapter that talks about the fall of humanity, where Adam and Eve messed everything up. And we're going to just read a few verses from this chapter, and I'll refer back to the chapter as we go on throughout the sermon. So today, we're going to read from verses 22 to 24. This is what the Word of God says in Genesis 3, verses 22 to 24. Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reached out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. And he drove out the man. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. This is the word of the Lord. The Bible starts by giving us an explanation of why is it that we feel the way that we feel, and why life is the way that it is. It teaches us three things in this passage here. Number one, that we all have been evicted from home. In fact, that is the title of the sermon today, Evicted from Home. Secondly, the text also teaches us that we are all in a pursuit of home. Not only have we been evicted, but we're trying to find home, secondly. And then lastly, there is a word of hope that we can be brought home. You can be brought home. There is hope for your sense of homelessness and lack of belonging here today. The hope is found in this text and what God has done through Jesus Christ. Okay? But before we get there, let's look at this first reality here, that we have been evicted from home. In verse 23, the verse starts by saying, therefore the Lord sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. Therefore. Every time that you read the scriptures and you find a therefore, that is now going to become the application of a body of teaching. It is the consequence of something that was said before in the passage. Why is it here, verses 23 and 24, that Adam and Eve had been kicked out of the Garden of Eden? The text here that we read today starts with Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. What happened? It's like when you run into somebody in the streets and their eyes are filled with tears. That just didn't happen out of the blue. There's an explanation why their eyes are filled with tears, why they look distressed. That's the same thing that's happening here in this text. The text that we read starts with them being kicked out, but there's an explanation why they had been kicked out of the garden, and that is found in verses 1 through 22. So God creates all things, and on the sixth day, which is the last day of creation, he creates mankind. He creates Adam and Eve, who are our forefathers, and he places Adam and Eve in the center of this world in which he has created, and the world is so perfect that it's called a garden. It's a literal garden. It's a garden where Adam and Eve are able to enjoy life without any of the frustrations of life that we have today. No death, no sorrows, no tears, no relational breakdown. Everything is in its proper place. And God is also present in that garden. Genesis starts with God coming to hang out with Adam and Eve in the garden at the end of the day. It's a place where God inhabits. It's heaven. It's a perfect place. But somewhere in their life in the garden, Adam and Eve decide to become their own masters and Lord. They decide to build a home within God's home. A home that's subversive to the home that God has built and has given them to live. And they get caught in that endeavor after crossing the line and doing something that God told them not to do, which is to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That act of defiance was an act that God interpreted as them wanting to live their lives apart from him. And so God says to them, because this is what God does, do you want to live your life apart from me? Do you think you can build a better future for yourself than the one that I can give you? Do you think that you can experience more joy on your own than the joy that comes from having a relationship with me, go and have it your way. Get out of my garden. Out of my garden. That's why they got kicked out of the garden. And ever since that day, since that happened, humanity has gone on living with this sense of nostalgia. We know that we were not made for this place. We know that we were really made for the original place that God created, the garden. We move on through life and always, even when the times are good, that there's something always missing. There's a Christian writer by the name of Eva Hoffman who wrote this. Since Adam and Eve left the garden, is there anyone that doesn't feel like an exile? We are ejected from our authentic self. An ideal sense of belonging, attuning to ourselves and others, eludes us. For those of you who are Brazilians, there is a word in Portuguese that describes this really well that doesn't exist in other languages, which is the word saudade. Have you heard of the word saudade? It's the word that we use to say when we miss something. You know, in English we say, I miss that place, or I miss that person. In Portuguese we say, I have saudades. It's not just I miss. It's a melancholic type of word covered with yearning. This word was originally invented by the Portuguese sailors. You know, the Portuguese in the 13th and 14th century were some of the greatest explorers that ever existed. They would jump on their ships and explore the world into the ocean. And many times it would take years and years and years before they could return back home. And to express their sentiment of longing for home while at the same time missing from home, they created this word called saudade that we use to this day. It's a nostalgic, melancholic type of yearning. It's what we feel at the deepest part of us when we're faced with the dilemmas and the frustrations of this world. I don't know if I shared my story with you, but I sort of grew up in between cultures. I posted in my Instagram this week a picture of when my parents first moved to the United States. I was a year old. I was in this picture portrayed in the deep snows of Philadelphia and its brutal winters. And I was just trying to remember if I had any memories when I was a year old. Back then, I couldn't find any memories. But my life has happened in blocks of 5 years, and I've always moved back and forth. I basically lived in the United States through the end of my elementary school days, and I moved back to Brazil, met an American girl, came up, then we got married and moved back, and then we're now in Miami. And my experience throughout my life, as some writers have talked about this theme of third cultured kids, has been very much the sense that I never belong fully in one place. When I lived in the South, my parents then moved from Philadelphia to Atlanta because my mom couldn't take the winter up north. I was one of the only brown kids in school. I was kind of weird. There was the black kids and the white kids, and I was the brown kid. And so I always felt very much displaced. Then when my family moved back to Brazil, I felt too Americanized for the Latino culture there. And so I always felt very uncomfortable wherever I was. And I married Beth, and we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, the deep South. Oh, man, I felt like an outcast in the deep South. Yeah, I can still speak some deep South. And so when we moved to Miami in 2008, about 16 years ago, going into 16 years, I was like, there is a place such as this, where everyone sort of shares my story. Seems like everyone here in Miami has grown up in the twilight zone, not fully belonging to one place or another. And I always felt the most comfortable here than any other place that has ever lived. This is a city, after all, where over 60% of its citizens are foreign born. But even in a place like this, where I feel at home, there's still moments that I don't feel at home. I don't feel at home when the cost of living starts to go up. I don't feel at home when I have to face traffic on US 1. Rush hour. You know that. Some of you guys are living in that sense of exile and displacement like I do at times. And maybe there are other things that bother you about this, but even in the best marriages, you're still going to feel displaced. Even in the best schools, you're going to feel displaced. Even if you end up working at your dream job, there's going to be things about it that are going to make you feel that you're not fully at home, regardless of where you find yourself in this life and whatever season you find yourself in. There's always going to be that sense that you are not 100% at home. And we have to learn to embrace that discomfort, to live in that tension and accept this truth. The text explains to us we have been evicted from home. But then secondly, the text also tells us that we're all in pursuit of home. Adam and Eve in verse 7, after they had sinned, right after they had sinned, they felt inadequate at home, which to me is crazy. Let's go to verse 7. Let me go and read verse 7 to you. I wish I had put verse 7 on the screen, but if you have a Bible, and that's why it's important for you to bring a Bible, this is what the text says. Then the eyes of both of them were open after they sinned, after they disobeyed God, after they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Their eyes were open, and they knew that they were naked. Now, they were always naked. God did not create them with clothes. They did not build clothes up until this moment, but they found themselves naked. And the text says, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So here it is. After they disobey God, all of a sudden, right at home, the world and the environment that they were created to live, the perfect place, they're now all of a sudden feeling inadequate and displaced. Have you ever been in a place like that? You've gone to a party or you've gone to a meeting and you're either underdressed or overdressed, or you notice that your fashion is probably like about 5 years behind everyone else. Somebody will always make the comment, that is so 2010. I love that shirt, that's so 2010. You're like, oh man. And I don't know if you felt that way, but that's how they felt. And to me, that's crazy because remember, verse 7 comes before verse 23. They hadn't been kicked out of the garden yet they felt that they were displaced, even though they were at home. Which means this, that homelessness is a condition of the heart. It's a condition of the human heart. They were already homeless before they left the garden. And what did they do as a result of that? They try to fix the problem. What did they try to do? We read it in the text. They see these trees and they're obviously naked. The first tree that they see is a fig tree. They see a vine. They see an apple tree, they see a fig tree, and they said, that leaf is bigger. And if you've been in the Middle East, you've seen them. Fig leaves can be actually pretty big, like this big. And so like, oh, that one is better than the apple tree leaf. And so they took that and they sewed clothes for themselves to cover up their nakedness. And ever since then, we have been doing the same. Why did they cover up their nakedness? So that they would fit in. So that they would regain that sense of comfort and that sense of hominess. You get it, homie? That they lost in the garden. And we've been doing the same. We've been trying to fix this sense of homelessness that we all carry deep inside of us by doing two things like they did. We're trying to fix the environment, we try to fix ourselves. What do you mean trying to fix the environment? We go to the social spaces that we inhabit and we force people to live by our ideals, by our rules. See, the polarization, the political polarization in the country right now, it's because one group is trying to force their ideals over another group because at the end of the day, that's how they feel at home, and they think that everyone should feel at home that way. That's what we do. It's just sowing fig leaves for ourselves. And when we can't fix the environment, when we can't control the environment, we try to control ourselves. And we say, I have to have the ideal image. So I go on about my business of building an image for myself. I have to have the right accomplishments because that's the only way that people are going to respect me and welcome me in. And so I try to accomplish in life so that I can be accepted and feel the sense of belonging. I say to myself, I have to get the right degree because only then will people in my field respect me. I have to find the right lover that will truly love me for who I am. And you'll never find the perfect lover, right? We're always trying to find a way to regain the sense of belonging. I'm going to move to the right place. I'm out of this place. I'm too uncomfortable with how this place has become. This is what happened in Miami several decades ago. When all the Cubans and the Latinos started to come in, I heard people say, hey, the last one to leave, bring the flag with them. Remember that story? Hey, those of you guys who lived through the days here, you know what I'm talking about. And we think that is going to accomplish anything, but it doesn't. And what ends up doing is that we become addicted to the way by which, listen to this is deep. We become addicted, as we embark in this journey, we become addicted to the way in which we're trying to find a sense of belonging that we never can break out of. Did you know this, that 68% of homelessness has to do with addictions? You think that you just built a house for homeless people and that'll take care of their problem of homelessness? No, it's the addictions that keeps them in the state of homelessness. And what keeps you and I in a state of spiritual homelessness is our addiction to image, it's our addiction to work, it's our addiction to romance, it's our addiction to comfort. Are we hitting close to home? We're getting there. But that's the issue. And that's the problem. And we have to realize that all our enterprises, all our attempts will never work unless, it's the last point of the sermon, we are brought home. I was watching this series on Netflix, The Society of the Snow. I don't know if you guys saw that. It's a group of Uruguayan rugby players that are flying through the Andes for a tournament, and their plane crashes in the Andes, and they're stuck there. How are they going to get out of there? They can't. They don't have the tools. They don't have the ingenuity. They don't have the navigation. They don't have the adequate apparatus, clothing to get themselves out of that place. They need help from above. Unless somebody comes and rescues them, they can't be rescued. And that's the story of the Bible, is this: the only way that we will return home or regain this sense of true belonging is if we're rescued. We can't find by ourselves the way back home. We can't. You can't. You're just going to keep going in circles. But the Bible says that there is hope to be brought back home. The good news is that you can come home. You can. Let me tell you something. The worst kind of homelessness is the type of homelessness that gives up on home, that gets used to the state of homelessness and this discomfort. And maybe some of you are here today and you've gotten used to this spiritual homelessness. And if you get used to it, there's no hope to find home. Because what truly kills us is not really the grief of life or the griefs of life, but what truly kills us is when we lose hope for a better future. And so I'm here to encourage you to say, if you're at that state, because I would imagine that there may be people in that state, don't give up. Don't give up on life. Don't give up the notion that you can come home where you will feel nourished, where you feel that you belong, because that's what home is, right? Home is the place where we feel that we belong, that we can let our hair down, the place that we are nourished, the place where we are refreshed. That's what home is. The place of familiarity. There's hope for that. If you're not there, don't give up. There's hope. You can come home, but you have to be brought back home. I don't know if you remember the text, but let's go back to verse 24, which is the last verse that we read. And in that verse, we read that after God kicked Adam and Eve out of his garden because they decided to be their own masters and Lord, he placed an angel at the gate. This is what the verse says, he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim. Cherubim is a type of angel. It's an angel of worship. And a flaming sword. The angel was holding this flaming sword that turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. So on the gate of the garden, he places this angel who's flashing this flaming sword, in all directions to keep anyone from coming back in. Why? Because if there was no angel, Adam and Eve would want to return and continue the enterprise that they started of building their own little kingdom inside God's kingdom. And what God is saying is, because the garden that God created is too good. What God is saying is, if you want to come back, you got to come back the right way. You can't come back with that attitude. You can't come back the way you left. You got to come back a different way. There's always the angel at the gate of the garden that we have to deal with. He is the bouncer at God's eternal home. That if you don't fit the profile, you can't come in. And yet, that's why Jesus comes into the world. Why does Jesus come into the world? Jesus comes into the world to bring us back into the garden. Jesus is from the garden. He comes to where we are, east of the garden, in order to bring us back into the garden. And it kind of works like, one of those baseball revolving doors that once you go through, you can't come back. I remember one time I was in Buffalo, New York for a wedding with my wife, and at the time, I was still waiting for my final green card documents. This is many years ago. And we were there, and the wedding was going to be in the evening. We were there in the morning, Niagara Falls. I said, I want to go to the Canadian side. And he says, well, you don't have the proper documents. It's okay, there's a gate here. She can go through that. Let's go through the gate. So I go through the gate, and we see on the other side, when I come back, the gate doesn't move the other direction. So the only way back now is through customs. So I come back through customs. Sir, do you have paperwork? No. What? They put me in a cell for like 4 hours until they could sort it out. Got in trouble. See, once you leave that garden, you can't just come back like that. You have to go through the proper authorities. And that's why Jesus comes into the world, because that's what happened. My father-in-law went after me, and he was an ex-military man, so he comes back kind of like my lawyer. He turns into my immigration lawyer, right? And he clears the situation up so that I can come back in the United States, even though I didn't have any documents. I don't know how that happened to this day. It was before September 11th. I'll just say it. But that's why Jesus comes into the world. He comes after us, who were kicked out of the garden, to bring us back home. In fact, Jesus says so in John 14. He says, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare a place for you." Jesus says, "I have come to bring you home, to take you to the place that your heart most longs for." Now, what's interesting about the statement that Jesus makes just a few chapters before the crucifixion, before his death and his resurrection, which means this, that the way by which Jesus brings us back into the garden is by going to the cross. What is the cross? The cross is Jesus coming under the sword of the angel that is at the door of the garden protecting its entrance. On the cross, Jesus is slashed to pieces in the same way as if he were to go through that sword. And Jesus does sort of go through that sword on the cross. He is slashed to pieces so that the way is now open so that we can come back into the garden. And the only way that you can come back into the garden is through Jesus. That's why he says, "I am the truth, the way, and the life. No one comes to the Father. No one comes back to the garden except through me." You can't find your way back home by yourself on your own, but you can come back home through Jesus. And Jesus is here today saying to all of us who do not have this sense of belonging, who feel displaced and like exiles in this world. Maybe you feel like an exile at home in the context of your own family and marriage. Maybe you feel like an exile at your work. Maybe you feel like an exile in the city. Your heart is looking for home, and Jesus says, come on. Homelessness is an issue of the heart. I'll bring your heart back home. He wants to bring your heart back home today. And I want to extend this invitation to you. And you can come and take advantage of that if you come to him through faith. Faith is what connects you to Jesus, who then brings you back home. Will you pray with me?